and I'm feeling got away from me. I'm trying to restore the feeling. Goddamn, wouldn't it be nice? You know that my mind is willing. Can't seem to get this right. I'm trying to restore the feeling.
Oh my god, I know, right? It's crazy. Yes, Senator, could you please comment on the latest scandal that your administration has had to face? Listen, I failed. I failed my country, my constituents, my family, my wife. But I'm not gonna let that stop me from running for president, okay? So, yeah. Has this ever happened to you? Are you also bad at drinking water, even though you're a human person and a grown adult and you should know how to drink out of a water bottle?
And thank you all for joining us, from so many places out here in the ether. I'm Kate Bernheimer, and I'm a professor in the Department of English, and along with my colleague, Ander Monson, I have the pleasure of co-directing this virtual series. I hope you joined us in time to see the amazing video previews, which will play again after our show. And I'd like to here again thank the Department of English and Antigone Books for co-sponsorship. And bravo, bravo, MFA students who've shared their short films tonight. Nostalgia, sadness, and tragic humor, perfection. It is Thursday, October 8th, 2020, and we were here to celebrate Billy Ray Belcourt behind me and in front of me, who will be introduced soon by our own Bojan Lewis. Some tiny logistics. In addition to the gift of reading to us, our kind and distinguished visitor has offered to reflect on some questions from you. If you would be so kind as to submit these during the reading using the Q&A function, not the chat, that would be great. So here, and I speak as much to you, cherished audience members, as to future archivists. Here on Planet Zoom, we Earthlings have learned to do things a little bit differently. So we each have a Q&A button at the bottom of what we call the Zoom screen. The Q&A button is where we request you pose those questions for us to share with our guest. Future archivists, we will try to answer your questions as well via telepathic communications. Through the rituals of storytelling, we connect to ancient times, we connect to each other, even in this virtual space. And I think in suffering, we yearn together for something better someday. Joining together like this strikes me as an act of wonder and hope. So thank you again for being here. It means a lot. I will turn you over in a moment to Bojan Lewis, our colleague here at UA and the author of, among other works, the poetry collection Currents, which received a 2018 American Book Award. He's got a forthcoming story collection I can't wait to read with fabulous Grey Wolf Press. To quote an essay by Bojan Lewis, beauty and memory and abuse and love, words to which I aspire. I have learned that it is possible to love myself, to say, all right, violence, you've had your limelight. Now it's time for you to take the back seat and observe for the remainder of the trip. As for anger, it can always take the helm while I watch the passing landscape. I think of protection, love, family, not property or accessory. I think of the days of sleeplessness and exhaustion. I think that one day I'll figure out how all this happened. I pass you along now to Bojan Lewis.
Am I unmuted? Yeah, okay. Good evening, buenas noches, everyone. It is with great honor that I have the opportunity to introduce writer and professor Billy Ray Belcourt. Billy Ray Belcourt hails from the Driftpile Cree Nation in Canada and is an assistant professor of Indigenous creative writing at the University of British Columbia. Belcourt's presence and voice is one of survival and infiltration. He has created a sovereign self-image of Indigenous peoples via his radical art and poetics. Belcourt's debut collection, This Wound is a World, published in 2017, won Canada's Griffin Poetry Prize, which made him the youngest poet to receive the prize, and is a collection that demonstrates this poet's dexterity of form and genre. Belcourt quickly followed his debut with NDN Coping Mechanisms, a Nancy Press 2019, and in it we find photography, redaction, prose poems, and ars poetica, as well as found and bent traditional forms that seek to define Indian perseverance against the multifaceted atrocities, policies, and dismantled treaties that settler colonialists have crafted and honed since first encountering the Indigenous and First Nation peoples of the North American continent. A favorite image of mine comes from the poem, The Terrible Beauty of the Reserve. Vehicles pass through in droves, but no one looks, so we disappear, hands intertwined, into the freedom of shimmering anonymity. Billy Ray Belcourt's nonfiction debut, A History of My Brief Body, is a love letter to the joy and ideation of an Indian utopia. Its essays offer us the beauty of queer indigenous experience, free us of colonial linearity, and solidifies this poet and thinker's abilities to show us the beauty and joy and the rebellious imagination of an Indian and utopia. Please welcome Billy Ray Belcourt.
Thank you so much for that really beautiful introduction. I'm really excited to be here digitally with you all, zooming in from my home in Vancouver, British Columbia. I'm from the Driftpile Cree Nation in northwestern Alberta and Treaty 8 territory. And I'm going to be reading a bit across the 3 books. So we'll start with some poems and then end with the essay collection. The creator is trans. The creator is trans and the earth is a psychology experiment to determine how quickly we mistake a body for anything but a crime scene, the product of older crime scenes. There is a heaven, and it is a place called gay. Gay as in let's hold up a world together. Gay as in happy to make something out of nothing and call it love, or anything that resembles a time in which you don't have to be those shitty versions of yourself to become who you are now. One day I'll open up my body to free all of the people caged inside me. I want to visit every Tim Hortons in Northern Alberta so that homophobes can tell me sad things like, I love you, your hair looks nice, you have nice cheekbones, until someone kills me. And then the creator will write my eulogy with phrases like, freedom is the length of a good rim job. And the most relatable thing about him, excuse me, was how often he cried watching wedding videos on YouTube. Homonationalism, am I right? My grandma thought there was a portal to the other side in her basement, but it was all of the women she had ever met, praying in a circle that she would give birth to a world without men, only women, made from other women's heartbreak. God must be an Indian, he said. For so many of you speak like the sky. Maybe I am a figure of speech. Maybe my body is an inside joke that we're all in on. Now is a time for metaphor. Give me a gender, but only if it is something like a candlelight vigil. Remember, grief is a way of making claim to the world. My cookam asked, is there something Indian about crying? Tonight, I will take my former lovers in my arms and convince them that I am not a graveyard. In the dark, none of us have names and no one is sacred. God must be an Indian, he said. This is not a love poem. Gay incantations. I fall into the opening between subject and object and call it a condition of possibility. When I speak, only the ceiling listens. Sometimes it moans. If I have a name, let it be the sound his lips make. There's no word in my language for this. Sometimes my kukum begins to cry and a world falls out. Grieve is the name I give to myself. I carve it into the bed frame. I am make-believe. This is an archive. It hurts to be a story. I'm the boundary between reality and fiction. It is a ghost town. You dreamt me out of existence. You are at once a map to nowhere and everywhere. Yesterday was an optical illusion. I kiss a stranger and give him a middle name. I call this love. It lasts for exactly 20 minutes. I chase after that feeling, which is to say, I want to almost not exist. Almost is the closest I can get to the sky. Heaven is a wormhole. I first found it in another man's armpit. Last night, I gave birth to a woman and named her Becoming. She is 4 Cree girls between the ages of 10 and 14 from northern Saskatchewan. We are a home movie I threw out by accident. All that is left is disdignified. People die that way. A lover's discourse. A boy in love with a boy becomes an open window. In every account of my adolescence, I hurled myself at a prison so that moonlight could tiptoe inside. The captive jutted out of me like music. Explanation. Homos, like poems, like city streets, are self-degrading. The sex drive and the death drive are one and the same. In the forest of men, shame dripped from my mouth a kind of honey. When I was licked clean and left with nothing, I made something lifelike in a kingdom with my cursed brethren. My lover traded in his horns for citizenship. We were grateful to be more than a cliff-bound herd of buffalo. Alas, we couldn't drink from the same river twice, but we kept at it, knee-deep in saliva. In our dying days, I stood on his shoulders to tug at low-level rain clouds. With a butter knife, I sculpted us a paranoid's paradise, a discovery. Even God's roof is bullet-holed. What to an NDN is the intrinsic goodness of mankind? I bottle up my feelings. In my serrated hands, the bottle shatters and still I am not free. What is freedom to a man with shards of glass moving through him? I want to write as though the sentence were a set of limbs to be puppeteered. With which words will I undertake this work of choreography? I dabbled in documentary poetics, but my sexual practices made me anti-systemological. I filmed every inconsequential second of my queer life and called it experimental cinema. When no one was looking, I invented post-structuralism. Who but an NDN would know that some days truth is a ghost who shouts in the voice of no one in particular. In other days, it is a secret nostalgia poured into the coffee cups of the living. Apropos of everything, what to an NDN is the intrinsic goodness of mankind. Maybe justice is a lover who regurgitates the English language so it comes back sweeter. Canada, why are your elevators filled with mud water? And what is it about a palm that makes a country feel like a garden? I dug and dug. I pulled out a bouquet of skyscrapers. I kissed each window softly. Is this not what an NDN does in a poem? I believe I exist. There are many ways to consume other people. Eradicate a concept, for example. Without hope, I am a thick fog stained by what I gobble up, something to weather. Under a starved light, I am a sticky dance floor on which a poem has been written. On Saturday nights, I get stickier and stickier until I'm not a dance floor anymore. Someone death drops. Yes. Someone drops dead, but he isn't white, so no one is there to see it. Except everyone is there to see it. They're just too busy thinking about how much they have changed for the better to open their fucking eyes. I'm a drag queen named Commodity Fetishism. I perform to Rihanna's Bitch Better Have My Money, except by money, I mean body. I'm an abstraction of an abstraction of an abstraction, and so on. I'm a glass half shattered. What is a ghost to a ghost but photocopied pity? Sometimes I want the language of a non-place, but no language is placeless. Prove to me that he who despises the world isn't also transfixed by it. I believe I exist. To live, one can be neither more nor less hungry than that. I believe I existed. One can't be left hungrier than that. And this is from the new book, A History of My Brief Body. I'm gonna read from a section called Futuromania, which is a concept of Roland Barthes in Morning Diary. He writes, as soon as someone dies, frenzied construction of the future, shifting furniture, etc. Futuromania. I'm a body of knowledge, not one of chemical compounds, which is to say it is the fate of NDNs to live as ideas do. It is on the res that one can hear words speak as though in a chorus. To tear the page is to tear our world apart. What shame to be a sentence on its knees. The day I obtained my driver's license, I followed a cumulus cloud through a maze of dirt roads until it evaporated. 40 minutes, that was all it took. I bore witness. No one asked this of me, but I wanted to keep watch of the dying everywhere, so I could figure out how to care for a bleeding sentence. At the time of writing, no one is in an argument with Canada. Yet Canada has its gloved hands over its ears as though someone were about to question why it is splayed out on a toilet like a widower on an open casket. Canada has yet to recoil at its reflection in a rearview mirror. America, its deranged brother, is already engorged on itself like a nesting doll. Canada lives in my refrigerator. It spoils my groceries just days old. It hangs like a uvula in my throat, governing my speech, draining it of its venom. Canada is more akin to noise pollution than the canopy of a boreal forest. Not a country, but a radioactive wolf in wolf's clothing. NDN writer bemoans the red condition, which is that wherever he goes, he posits his queerness as a metaphysical conundrum. With each lispy word, modern history aggregates inside him like a wasp colony. Everywhere he's met by rows and rows of Michel Foucaults who promise he is freer than he thinks. NDN writer chuckles to himself now and then about the idiosyncrasy of this. NDN writer is reminded of Judith Butler, who in Gender Trouble ruminates on what she calls a sentimental Foucault, the Foucault who, despite his paranoid habits of diagnosis and disavowal, sometimes paused and stood beside himself to nod to a less disciplinary elsewhere. Legendarily, Foucault seldom spoke about himself. He and NDN writer don't have this in common. But NDN writer does suspect that Foucault's sentimentality had everything to do with something he has already written down in another poem. No one runs to theory unless there is a dirt road in him. NDN writer is hard at work on the paradox that one can be born into a past and at the same time indecipherable to it. That is his job, to keep watch of paradox. NDN writer knows that it isn't a new undertaking. To be unoriginal might have humiliated NDN writer a few years ago, but it doesn't matter because today he's in a boat with a bunch of Foucaults, minutes away from an island where the only universal is that there are no bodies to bury and thus no longer a need to make shovels out of our heavy hands. Until today, I railed against the grisly fate reserved for men like me. I'm an anachronism in the way that all queer men are anachronisms, far too early. I'm a poet in the way that all queer men are poets, not a novel thought likely. Ours is the audacity of begging for what Maggie Nelson calls a compassionate wilderness. Jose Esteban Munoz wrote, "The queer citizen subject labors to live in a present that is calibrated to sacrifice our liveness." I don't need a record of my here-ness. What I do need is to take ecstasy with Jose Esteban Munoz. Paradise is wherever he is. Until then, I will try to be a pretty wound at least once. Confession, I'm not yet comfortable taking my shirt off in a poem. Subjectivity abuses, subjectivity rescues. Men shoved my head into the clouds. I missed so much. There is humiliation in this dystopia too. Here my words appear in the air, upside down. My mouth is a dirty floor. I'm sweeping up the dirt with my imagination. And lastly, I want to read a short bit from an essay called Robert. July 2017. Post-sex, fixed in the pale light of an overhead lamp, sprawled across my mattress on the floor. You are so motionless, Robert, it looks as though you're a painting ruled by sentiment. I hope you're capable of such grace so that I too can be. We, two men of no aesthetic significance, engineered beauty from stolen time with our lumbering bodies. All my psyche can hold is the past, present, and future tense of the moment. I lie down beside you, the sheets rustling beneath us as though we've made a forest floor of our yearnings. I want to live a whole human life in this bedroom of wet hands, where, for evenings at a time, the world starts and ends without celebration or remorse. What I know, we aren't running away. The eyes are too hungry for their own good. There is yellow of endless gradations. I want to see you tiptoe into all of them. Beside you, bound together in the same puny blaze, there is little to believe in besides the promise of our infinite luminosity. Dozing off, it occurs to me that if there is a corrective to the problem of my existential loneliness, It is this study of light. Thank you.
I'm spotlighting myself so people can get some of the applause that we otherwise don't get to do in these events.
I do not know.
Thank you. That was a beautiful reading. Audience members, anybody, feel free to jump into the Q&A with questions, but I'm going to start it off with one that might be fairly predictable to anybody here who knows me. But throughout your body of work, across the various forms in which you work, I hear so many, well, I hear so much orality, of course. It's like there's a really oral quality to your work at the same time as it engages really deeply with critical theory. So I think that that is like deftly, intuitively done. I have a question about the orality. There are so many references to gobbling things up, to mouths, to just the gobbling of stories and the gobbling of ideas, and even the like hunger for not only stories, but for love or for belonging. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to the orality in your writing, but perhaps too, as a reader, like were there books that you encountered in childhood or otherwise, or stories that somehow imprinted on you folklorically or just autobiographically?
Right. Well, I'll say that the image of the mouth does repeat in my work across the three books.
Mm-hmm.
And that it begins perhaps in the first book in a poem called There is a Dirt Road in Me, where I say, make my mouth into a jar, spit inside me, throw me into the air, leave me there. And then there's, in the poem I read about the mouth being a dirty floor, I think there's the two different valences operating there, the latter having to do with language, possibilities, impossibilities of political speech, you know, what we condemn ourselves to in the drama of historical redress, you know, just the ongoingness of it. Also, I'm thinking about what is left unsaid, and, you know, often I've heard remarked about my prose especially, that one of the qualities of it is that there's this ongoing choreography of the said and the unsaid. And I think, you know, that happens in the service of image making, that like that's what I prioritize in my writing, at least in these books to date. And then thinking about embodiment, that the first book was so much about sketching what Butler calls the, I'm borrowing her language in describing the body as a site of both constitution and severance, and that paradoxical condition we can't run away from, and that's actually, you know, fundamentally where one experiences survivability, livability, unlivability. And I think that, you know, as a queer Indigenous person that received notions of embodiments, whether those be normative ones or homonormative ones, that experiencing oneself as not, you know, being hailed by those, though alienating, also opens up ways for, you know, different ways of being in the world. And I think that the poems often, you know, document that experience of slippage or becoming, you know, misaligned with the world.
You must be psychic, because you have anticipated the very next question in the chat, which goes to the theme or motif of anachronism. which you discuss in the poetry. And one of our guests, Rose, would love to hear more about anachronism. And you're talking also about transformation, but Rose's question also asked you to speak more about Indigenous queerness. So you could not be more like in tune with this event, with the frequency. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that I've argued in my academic work, which I don't totally engage too deeply with anymore. But I've argued that that queer indigeneity is a kind of metaphysical conundrum, and I said that in the poem in A History of My Roof Body, the prose poem, because, as I already said, you're born into both a past and a present to which you're not totally legible, and that though that illegibility can leave you susceptible to violence of all kinds, it also allows one to occupy a place that empowers other sensibilities, modes of perception that don't leave you fixated with, the normative or the given, but the prefigurative, what's to come. I think of, so much of the work of queer theorists and queer poets, especially, is the work of, a romance of the future, of what's to come, and that there, one can hold in the space of intimacy their desire for something different. And I think that in terms of to bring it down to a more, material level, I was often asked about my decision to write, personal essays. In Canada, the book is marketed as a memoir. So I've been asked, about my decision to write a memoir at the age that I am at. I'm in my 20s. And I think, that the body of queer Indigenous literature is still, unfortunately, minimal. And so, to wait to document, one's queer Indigenous life seems irresponsible. And that we do need, this larger span of books from a large span of writers. And I think also that though we don't always intend this, that in writing about our grief or our desires and longings, that we can be like lighthouses for others like us, or experiences that are proximal to ours. Yeah.
I think that's incredibly powerful and phenomenally generous and kind. Like, your aesthetics and your ethics are made of kindness. It's really amazing that to hear the decisions you make and how you make them as an artist and an intellectual. That's amazing. We have a question that goes to that a little bit sideways, but I think, again, you've anticipated exactly what comes next, which is how you go about weaving theory into your poetry. I think that what you just said almost answers that question, because you're attending to questions of identity and desire, in multiple forms. But if you want to maybe address it a little bit from a how-to point of view, I think we're always hungry for that a little bit too.
Can I sort of just jump in to say, I think the second half of that question might be interesting to think about too, that what does poetry add to theory for you?
Totally. So I often get a question of this sort, and I've tended to say that I think that poetry and theory are streets or back alleys, in the same neighborhood, in that they intersect, and that I find myself at their intersection. And I was just listening to a clip of talk of Judith Butler's today with my students in my poetic seminar. We were talking about grievability, and in this talk, Butler talking about the, generalized ontological condition of being bound to others, says that, or, asks, what am I without you? And Butler goes on to say, it turns out that I was not here, or that if I am here and you're over there, that the I adheres in the crossing. And I think that, that crossing, like poetry and theory, like the form of writing I'm engaging in is in that crossing as well. And I've always believed, and I sensed it before I could, philosophize about it, but I've always thought that poetry and theory require a similar conviction, which is that you don't hold too much hope in the present, or that you don't have a romance of the present, that you are compelled to trace the invisible, or the makeshift, or hints of a futurity that is not bogged down by the current configuration of feelings and norms and aesthetics. So I actually think that they're like deeply complementary, poetry and theory. And if we can sit with some post-structuralist work, some philosophers' work, and with the right amount of generosity, see in it poetry.
I think that too often there's too much binary thinking about so many things, and poetry and theory are, fall into that as well for some people in dialogues, right? That there's scholarship, and then there's creative work. It's all a form of daydreaming in a sense. I love everything that you just said about that. That's really.
Can I jump in a little bit in the pause?
Yeah.
I don't mean to cut you off like Mike Pence,
Please.
if that's what I'm doing. But I was really curious listening to, especially like the last poem that you read before you got into the book of essays or memoir, whatever people want to call it. And I'm really interested in the sort of slippage between poem and essay. Like there's so much essays like in like the earlier poems, and there's so much poems in the essays. And I was wondering if you could talk about like what that boundary is like for you as a writer, I guess.
Yeah, I want to pull up this thing I retweeted last week. I can't remember exactly who the poet is. Harriet Mullen, I think, but I could be misremembering that. Saying that, poetry has all these rules and conventions. They're taught and retaught, produced and reproduced. And, because of that, acquire a certain sense of almost like a kind of sacredness where we can't break those, but that in this poet's opinion is an incitement to rebellion and to reappropriation. And so I've never held sacred the rules or the conventions of poetry writing and essay writing. Genre, I guess, would be more specific way or specific place to locate that rebelliousness. And why I was, I think, compelled to write is because when I read certain writers' works in my undergrad, that like theorists in particular, that like Fred Moten and Foucault and Butler and Munoz, Saidiya Hartman, the list could go on and on, but what I was most moved by and altered by was not logic or narrative, but the feeling of being transported by the musicality of language. And I think Moten's a great example of writing, you know, deeply uncategorically or uncategorical writing. And so those, you know, that sort of tradition was what moved me to write in the first place. And I feel really indebted to those thinkers. And I think that's how I end up writing essay poems and poem essays.
I couldn't believe my great fortune when in 1984 I showed up in college as this like super not popular, not mainstream, but anxious kid. Showed up at college and got to take a class with Judith Butler. That's how old I am. But I was like, oh my gosh, we're allowed to think, like, these are ideas. these are things people talk about. I was just like, this can't be real. Pinch, you know, I just thought, well, all the things that made me think that I was, that the things were wrong with me, there were people actually talking in this way that intuitively made sense somehow. And it wasn't anything that anybody had ever let me in on at all. Sounds like you had sort of a moment like that a little bit as a reader and as a student, and something just lit up that was already in you, it sounds like, but it lit up somehow. I was wondering if there was anybody earlier in your life who encouraged you as an intellectual, as an artist, as who you are. Was there anybody earlier at all?
I can think of, I took in my third year of my degree, my first degree, I took a critical animal studies course with Dr. Chloe Taylor. And she was, I think, the first prof or in person to say that what I was producing or what I was writing was theory. And, you know, she really threw, you know, a number of resources at me to you know, develop that instinct. And yeah, I really do attribute a lot of that, like, initial learning in a direction of theory to her. I also think that it just, I remember being, like, throughout my entire undergraduate degree, jealous that I wasn't a grad student. And then got to grad school and I was like, oh, this is not the magical world I thought it was. But yeah, as like, just feeling so like ravenous, and yeah, doing all this like supplemental reading on my own time, like spending all of the money that my band was giving me on books, or like a large chunk of that money on books. So yeah, I think, yeah.
We have a great question, I think, that's good. As maybe a closing question, I don't know, I have no clock here, but do you have any sense, now that we've looked back on your beginnings in a bit, like, where are you going next? Like, what is the future? I mean, you write about futurity, what's the future, or what's happening next, do you know? And next means, like, right, as soon as you say next, you're in the past, so who knows?
Well, I've been working on fiction. I'm trying to write about, you know, where I come from, with Northern Alberta, which has not really existed in the literary imagination here in Canada. And I thought, you know, I remember a lot of this essay collection came out of my attempts to write an autobiographical novel. And I, you know, just didn't feel like I had quite honed the technicalities of novel writing, and so a lot of it, you know, I stripped it down and, you know, brought out the truthfulness and made these essays. That's sort of what compelled the use of fragments in a lot of cases. But yeah, I'm working on this, like, I guess, like, slim novel. I think I realized I write slim books. Tiny books. But yeah, so it's about a host of people with varying experiences of embeddedness in systems of oppression. Like, rural life is what I'm zeroing in on, and the ways that in, you know, places outside urban centers, like generally fall out of view of political concern. And it's in these places where power is often incredibly embedded and pervasive. And I'm trying to figure out how that comes to be.
Sounds amazing. It sounds like you know how to do it. I think that's the secret. No, only you can write that book. Mm-hmm. Only you can do that. It sounds a bit like the question you asked, like, what is a ghost to a ghost earlier in the reading? It sounds like that embedded quality is continuing on.
Right.
Those nested dolls. Yeah. That sounds amazing. I'll read it, send it tomorrow. Like, give it to, we want that paperback. Don't you think small books are the best? The kind you used to be able to buy and put in your back pocket, like of your Levi's? You got to bring those back. Thank you so much. Are there any more questions? Andrew, do you have our Bojan quietly sitting?
I mean, that seemed like a good stopping point. I mean, the thing that I love about that is like that not, you know, I mean, no one really knows how to write a novel, but like the idea of just not feeling like constrained by like what the novel is, or if you feel like the sense of like what the novel is, well, fuck it. I mean, that desire to like subvert or destroy is very strong in your work and offers a lot of really great energy. It's one of the things I really loved about A History of My Brief Body, and then moving back into the poems, is that sense of like, you know, I mean, I can do this. I'm doing this, and now I've done it. And I loved seeing the little chunks of like the failed novel, the aspirational novel in the book.
Yeah.
And I mean, would love to see. Might as well break into the third genre and then don't stop there. Screenplays are next.
Totally. Thank you.
You can do it. You're gonna do. I just love the naturalness with which you move across forms. Like they're just, and they feel very much to emanate from the same mouth. To go back to the beginning, they feel very embodied. So, thank you so much. It was really lovely to have you here. I wish that we could hear more. So we'll have to bring you back, right?
Well, our grad students can hear a little more tomorrow.
Oh, that's right. So lucky.
In colloquium. So we have that for us. But everyone else, that's what you get.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And we've got a lovely after show film for you. So
yeah, thanks a lot, Billy Ray. It was fantastic.
Good night.
All right. We're going to go out. Hopefully I don't mess this up again. Thank you all for coming.
Still waiting on a feeling that me. I'm trying to restore the feeling. Goddamn, wouldn't it be nice? You know that my mind is willing. Can't seem to get this right. I'm trying to restore the feeling.
God, I know, right? It's crazy. Yes, Senator, could you please comment on the latest scandal that your administration has had to face? Listen, I failed. I failed my country, my constituents, my family, my wife. But I'm not gonna let that stop me from running for president, okay? So, yeah. Has this ever happened to you? Are you also bad at drinking water, even though you're a human person and a grown adult and you should know how to drink out of a water bottle?